All right.
All right. So
Sorry about that, everyone.
no worries. So good afternoon, everyone. This is the Wednesday, April 26th, 2023 meeting of the Science and Data Subcommittee of the Vermont Climate Council. My name is Jared Duval, co-chair of the subcommittee with Colin Smythe. So I am going to put in the chat a link to the agenda for our meeting today. Actually, if somebody else has that handy, doesn't mind putting it in. I seem to have lost that tab, but I'm happy to give a brief overview of the agenda from the printout I have, which is, well, first on the published agenda was approving the minutes. I believe we have a draft of those minutes, but they haven't been formatted into the regular format. So I would just propose that we wait and consider and approve those minutes at our next regularly scheduled meeting, unless anybody objects. Okay. And then Richard Hopkins, thank you for volunteering to take notes for today's meeting. The main agenda items that we have are, so earlier this week, the Climate Action Office, thanks to a lot of hard work from Colin and others, published the updated greenhouse gas emissions inventory and forecast, along with an updated methodology document. And so we thought it would be really timely and relevant to spend some time going over some of the updates to the inventory and methodology, and have a chance for discussion and questions. And then, like we have with our regular agendas, updates from the different contractual work that is moving forward, especially on the measuring and tracking progress tool and that request for proposals, and then the life cycle analysis. So pretty light in terms of the number of topics, but they're substantive topics. So that's the proposed agenda. And then we have time for public comment at the end of the meeting. Is there anyone who has any questions or suggested additions or changes to the agenda before we dive in? Okay. Yeah, I'm not, so if whoever is joining by phone wants to identify themselves for the minutes in case it's a subcommittee member, that would be great. If it's not, and it's just somebody joining as a member of the public, that's fine. You don't need to.
No, it's Ken Jones, and I'm traveling. So.
Oh, hi Ken. Thank you.
Yeah.
Jared, could I don't see it on the agenda, but a day or two ago there was a meeting of the Climate Council at which, among other things, the report from the biomass study group was presented, and I would love to hear a report about how that went and what the outcome of that was.
Great. Yeah, I would be happy to address that. I think others could as well. Maybe we can add that to that second part of the agenda when we're doing those other updates.
Thank you.
Sounds great.
So with that, turn it over to you, Colin, for the overview of the inventory.
All right. That sounds great. And
oh, Claire, sorry, I see your hands up.
Sorry, I might have missed this while I was looking for the agenda link to which I just put in the chat, but I didn't see minutes for the February meeting posted. Sorry.
yes.
Yeah, I just wanted to flag that.
Sorry, I just need to kind of put those into the standard template, and I should have those done soon. I just didn't quite get to it before the meeting started. So yeah, I think, Jared, correct me if I'm wrong, Jared, I think you suggested we could just approve those next meeting.
Yeah,
that works for folks. Leslie Ann took the minutes last time. They're very comprehensive notes. So
Thanks.
Sure. All right, and so I guess I'll just start by asking folks. I kind of have it. I have a kind of a brief presentation for the inventory that I kind of tailored from one that I gave to the House Energy and Environment, I don't know, maybe a month and a half ago. Are people interested in walking through kind of that slide presentation and kind of diving into a little bit more depth in the sectors, or would you prefer kind of a higher level, kind of just major changes and just ask whatever questions you would like? Preference from anybody?
I think a higher order maybe to start might be helpful. I don't know what others want to say, and then sector by sector if we need to get into the weeds.
Okay. So maybe I'll just pull up this presentation and kind of go through the first couple, which is more of a basic overview of the inventory. And then if we want to get into the sector by sector, we can do that. Does that sound reasonable? All right, great. Let me just share. Okay. Can you all see that?
Yes.
All right, great. Okay. So I guess I'll start off with this is a very newly released greenhouse gas inventory. It's the 1990 through 2020 inventory, and it just posted it online yesterday, in fact. And so this is more, these first couple of slides are more about kind of just the inventory in general, but that new report is out now, and I'll talk in a little bit about kind of some of the differences in this release as compared to the last releases. But for those of you who are not familiar with the greenhouse gas emissions inventory, it's essentially a picture, an estimate of kind of all the anthropogenic or human-caused greenhouse gas emissions in the state. And it's kind of broken out by economic sector, and it covers kind of the major greenhouse gases that are covered kind of by the EPA national emissions inventory report for greenhouse gases. And so you see on the slide, these are the sectors that are covered. Transportation is almost always the highest one. In this report, actually, it is just edged out by the buildings and thermal or RCI sector. We expect that to not be the case going forward, because the dip that you'll see in a minute this year is for 2020, I'm sorry, not this current year, in 2020, which is what the latest year in the inventory is really due to the kind of transportation emissions decreases due to COVID and everybody kind of staying home. So in 2021, we're already seeing fuel sales and vehicle miles traveled rebound. We don't have an official number for 2021 yet, but we expect the transportation will take over the top spot again. Yeah, I should have mentioned, but please feel free to interrupt me as I go. Richard, go ahead.
Yeah, just in terms of the 2020 dip, in data from some jurisdictions, the increase in use of home heating fuel more or less balanced the decrease in transportation fuel. But you're saying that in Vermont that didn't happen.
No, at least it did not happen. And I can get into this a little bit more in the weeds, but the data set we use for the RCI sector, as I think you're aware, Richard, is a large federal data set. And so that did not reflect that increase. So no, it did not balance the transportation sector declines for us in that space. So yeah, sorry, go ahead, Jared.
Sorry, I should have raised my hand. I did want to just note one thing that while I fully agree with you that the 2020 dip in transportation emissions is due to the decreased gasoline sales and vehicle miles traveled during that first year of the pandemic, and that it's likely that in 2021, 2022, 2023, those transportation emissions will likely kind of regain that top spot in terms of the plurality of the largest share of our statewide emissions. I did think that it was notable, and I imagine you'll talk about this later, that when you projected forward, and I know that there are a lot of kind of assumptions and caveats about those 2025 and 2030 emissions levels, that the projection for the 2030 emissions levels was that the thermal sector emissions or the RCI sector emissions would be higher than the transportation sector emissions. And my understanding is that's primarily because the transportation sector reductions in emissions out to 2030 are contemplating higher levels of EV adoption, because that's being driven by policy and regulatory change and requirements, whereas we don't have a policy or regulatory framework that would require yet the same reductions on the thermal side. So I think it's just worth teasing this out in terms of moments in time, and I fully agree that in the short term, it's likely that the transportation regains that top spot, but out to 2030, I did think that projection of the thermal sector or residential, commercial, and industrial fuel use being the highest emitting sector on a business as usual trajectory was an important one, and I look forward to discussing that more.
Yeah, I think that's a great point. It's hard to tell what the future will bring. I think even with the vehicle kind of electrification, kind of ACC2, Advanced Clean Cars 2, that's going to require those kind of additional electric vehicles to be brought to Vermont to be sold. That's not really going to kick in until 2025. And so it'll be interesting to see what happens in the thermal space. But that's a good point. It's kind of a lot of unknowns at this point. But yeah, thanks for flagging. Yeah, so I guess I'll just, without getting into probably as much detail as I just went into there, but the remaining sectors are the residential, commercial, industrial fuel use, which is we call RCI, which is really the buildings and thermal sector that Jared was just referencing. Electricity generation, industrial processes, agriculture, waste and wastewater, and the fossil fuel industry. And you would think the fossil fuel industry would be really large. It's actually incredibly small because most of the emissions from fossil fuels are captured in the other sectors. That's really pretty much exclusively the leakage from pipelines of natural gas pipelines and services. So it's a pretty small number compared to the rest of them. And yeah, so the inventory kind of relies mainly on tools that were put together by the EPA for states to calculate inventories such as this. And a lot of those tools rely on kind of the large federal data sets that I mentioned. You can generally kind of insert some of your more local data into those tools if it fits, and if it goes back, we calculate the inventory from 1990 kind of to as current as we can get it, because 1990 is obviously our baseline for all of our emissions reductions requirements. Well, to go back, for some of them, 2005 is the other one. So it does do that kind of historical estimation as well. And so that's another kind of tricky part, is you have to have data that goes back that far, or at least be able to maintain some level of comparability as best you can back there if you're going to update your data or methods. So I'm going to jump to the next slide unless there are any questions on that kind of piece. But this is, I guess, just going into a little bit more depth than what I was just talking about, where the methodologies, a lot of them are EPA and kind of the what's called the SIT, or the state inventory tool. There is a little bit of differentiation from that depending on the sector, but that's kind of the main tool we rely on. And kind of the methods that we use are they're consistent with IPCC and EPA, and there is definitely there's definitely a lot of kind of movement, especially in like the land use space in this right now. Some of the other kind of standard sectors are much more kind of easier to define and easier to kind of nail down. But yes, we're always trying to kind of improve the methods and the data sets as best we can as things change in this space. And yeah, I mentioned try to maintain the comparability, and it also helps to kind of just get a better understanding. We were just talking to a little bit earlier about kind of which sectors, and even drilling down into the sectors, which portions of which sectors are contributing the most to the overall emissions in the state. Claire, go ahead.
Thanks. And if you're going to get to this later, feel free to just keep going. But I'm just curious, as we electrify a lot of the heating and transportation, if that is going to lead to any methodological changes in how we track in the greenhouse gas inventory in terms of understanding like sector specific emissions, knowing that obviously a lot of those will shift to the electricity sector if we keep our current accounting methods.
Yeah, that's an interesting question. I think I don't really have a great answer for that. I think we certainly could consider different ways of looking at it. I mean, this is kind of just one framework for how we look at these emissions. But we could certainly break it up differently, as long as we don't double count things, obviously. So I think that's a good point, and it would be interesting to try, and kind of thinking through this on the fly a little bit, but it would be interesting to try to kind of assign the emissions that are electricity related to the various sectors, and see if we could do that in a way where we were confident there wouldn't be overlap. I'd have to think that through a little bit first, if we would have the data that would be kind of granular enough to do that. But
yeah, I think I'm doing the same math in my head and thinking we'd obviously need some sort of like disaggregated end use data, which we probably don't have currently. But
right.
Yeah, just in terms of our understanding of how we account now and assign to different sectors, knowing that will be shifting going forward.
Yeah, no,
I will know. Oh, sorry, Colin.
No, go ahead, Jared.
I was just going to say that on this point, and then I want to get to Elizabeth's question, but on this point, while we don't do it for emissions, one of the ways that EAN has addressed this challenge of categorization on the energy use side is, so folks who are familiar with our annual progress report, we have those kind of energy pies where it compares the total amount of energy use in the transportation, thermal, and electricity sectors. And so we had to make a decision, where do you show the energy use that is electricity, but for thermal or for transportation? And so what we decided to do was, using data that we have from Efficiency Vermont, the Public Service Department, EIA, estimate the amount of electricity use that is going to transportation, primarily from electric vehicles, and estimate the amount of electricity use that's going to residential, commercial, and industrial kind of building heating, primarily the amount of resistance electric heating estimates that we have, or from heat pumps, and subtract that from the electricity pie and add it into the respective transportation and thermal pies, but label it as electricity being used. So that's a subtraction, so it's not double counted, but it's moved elsewhere. But what that means is that the presentation of electricity isn't all electricity use. It's really the electricity that's used for appliances and lighting and basically anything that's not heating or transportation. You could do it the other way, but anyway, I think that it makes sense the way that the inventory does it now, and wouldn't necessarily suggest that, but just wanted to offer that that's a way we've done it when we are trying to categorize and track energy use by sector. But Elizabeth, if you're not able to speak right now, happy to ask your question from the chat for you. But so Colin, I don't know if you can see it. The question from Elizabeth in the chat was, does the inventory capture emissions from refrigerants?
Yes, it does. That would be, and I can get into a lot more detail in that space if you want later on, but it is in the ODS, ozone depleting substances substitutes component of the industrial processes sector. So yes, and for that piece, we use a tool that California developed for a bunch of the U.S. Climate Alliance states that does it kind of based on they have some very, very well researched and based on kind of their reporting program data that they've boiled down to per capita values for that. And so we kind of use those and are able to adjust them in this tool based on specifically like vehicle populations and kind of use of AC and use of heat pumps and things like that. So, but yes, they are included. All right, well, maybe I will move on to the next slide here. Okay, so yeah, that I guess will be my high level overview of kind of what the inventory is and the sectors. In terms of this kind of new release, which as I mentioned was from 1990 through 2020, in previous years, it has just kind of been a single report, and I've kind of included both the emissions and a little bit of information, and then kind of the method for which those were calculated. In this release, we're kind of separating out those two components. And so the report itself, and I think I linked both of these in the agenda, but the report itself is definitely shorter, but it's kind of the historical emissions, and I have the graphs in the next coming slides, and just kind of a little information about what the sector is, what it covers, but the actual kind of data sets and tools or methodologies used to calculate it are in that kind of companion methodology document now, which is a much more in-depth and deeper dive into those sectors and the data itself. The idea being that the inventory totals will change kind of obviously every year when we put this out, but the methodology will largely remain the same unless there are specific changes that we want to make. And so that document will be more of a static document, just to be updated kind of as needed as these methodology or data source changes happen as we go through time. I will also just note that in the coming months, we're going to work to set kind of a consistent schedule for release of the inventory. I feel like this is especially important as we get kind of closer to the mandated reduction level timeline to have some certainty in terms of when the inventory is going to come out. And also,
can I just ask you to pause on that? I'm just curious if you've talked yet about kind of a general time of year that you're going to be aiming for, or if that's still under discussion.
I think it's still under discussion, but kind of what we've been throwing around is, I think, in the like June, July timeline, timeframe, I mean, but yeah, that kind of hasn't been finalized yet. I think we're still talking about that internally. And I guess the second piece of that will be in terms of making methodology changes going forward. Previously, I'm kind of in discussions on groups with various states, and everybody is kind of working through this process of constantly improving their methodologies and things like that. And to this point, it has kind of been just understanding what other states are doing and kind of what's possible in Vermont based on our data, and sometimes a level of effort depending on specific tools. But going forward, the idea is to have kind of a more transparent process for updating methodologies in the inventory. And the idea being to potentially run it through you all in science and data to kind of review those methodologies and, yeah, I guess help make a decision on what would be appropriate changes to make. And that process is not obviously finalized either, but that's an idea that we're throwing around right now. With, I guess I will just say, caveat that we also need to determine kind of a threshold for what triggers that kind of process, because there's so many different factors and considerations that go into the inventory that asking you to weigh in on any change probably doesn't make a ton of sense. So figuring out, yeah, like kind of like what constitutes a major change that would be worth review is something we need to work through as well. So yeah, I don't know if there are any questions on that, but yeah, Richard, go ahead.
As some of you know, I have overseen the development of greenhouse gas inventories for 2 times for Addison County, Vermont, where I live. And we did one in the summer of 2020, and then we did another in the summer of 2022. And we're planning to do another one in the summer of 2024. I would really like to be able to follow the state methodology for the local or county level report. So I have a real interest in how you do things. Unfortunately, some of the methods that are usable at the state level are not usable at the county level currently, much less at the town level, where it would be even more difficult. An example of that is that the smaller the geographic unit of analysis, the less sense it makes to estimate the impact of burning wood for heat by counting the decrement and the amount of standing timber in the same jurisdiction. Addison County is probably a net exporter of wood for burning, I would guess. I don't know that for a fact. Other counties are probably net importers. Chittenden County, for example, is almost certainly a net importer of wood to burn for heat. So saying, well, we'll estimate how much carbon dioxide we produce from burning wood by monitoring what happens to our forest is not a sensible way to go. I'm not even sure it's sensible for a unit the size of Vermont. I think it remains to be seen whether it really makes sense. It probably makes sense for a unit the size of California, but that's a different issue. So anyway, as you go forward with modifying the methods that you use or thinking about modifications for the methods that you use for future inventories, I hope that you will keep thinking about whether these methods are generalizable to geographic subunits of the state. Clearly, some of them are not currently.
Yeah, sorry, I'll just respond real quick, Jared, but I think that I think that's a great point. And yeah, I certainly talked to you about greenhouse gas inventories many times before, Richard, but yeah, I'm always happy to talk through options for doing that. I think some of the limitations are just that probably the available tools for doing it at a county or a municipal level aren't really going to work at a state level. And like, I think that the data needs between the two is not always exactly the same either. And so I think finding how to either disaggregate the state estimates to a county more accurately, or use a different tool to build it up from a county level, but trying to use some of the state data sets. I think that's a tough space, but I think it's important, and I think it can be very informative for the county and municipal kind of actions and decisions. I will definitely keep it in mind. I guess I don't have a great answer for you, but yeah, it's definitely an interesting crossroads and issue.
I'm just going to make two other points really quickly here. One is that the state government would have it within its power to collect data that will be very helpful at the county level that it doesn't currently collect. And this has to do with, for example, the county, or even better, the town in which fuel oil and propane are delivered, and not just the data about the location of the wholesaler. The same, with gasoline, the county or even the town where the gasoline is sold would be very helpful to have. We currently have to go way around and back in order to we have to pile estimates on estimates in order to estimate the amount of gasoline and diesel that is burned on the road in our county. And I'm very insecure about those estimates. So anyway, to the extent that you have influence with other agencies in state government where you can help us advocate for collection of certain kinds of data through the tax system primarily that is not currently collected, it'll be very helpful, both in the area of fuels for buildings and in the area of fuels for vehicles.
All right, I will definitely keep that in mind. And Claire, I know you've been in discussions that are kind of around that as well. So yeah, keep flagging it, and hopefully we can get that for you at some point.
So I just want to briefly say, just at a high level, first, congratulations, Colin, to you for all of the work that goes into this. It's an incredibly impressive inventory and methodology document, and just the quality of it is very impressive, and I know it was a lot of work. So I want to say that first.
Thank you.
I also want to say that on this last bullet point that you've got on this slide, Colin, the review process, Colin knows this, but I want to share it with the rest of the committee. I did a review of the whole inventory and the methodology document, and noticed a couple of things where I had feedback on, and I sent that to Colin with some suggested, additional explanation of an appendix, correcting a typo, the type of things you find in any report. And so I just want to say that I personally think a review process with the Science and Data Subcommittee would be really helpful, both for subcommittee members and for the kind of just the final product of the inventory and methodology document, and would hope that we do that for both, not just the methodology document, but also for the inventory. And just wanted to pause to see if there's other committee members who feel similar. I may be the only one who really wants to dig in on that review, but just want to flag that I think it would be helpful to have that process. And I don't know as though it would be the entire committee, but I think it would be a good moment maybe, and we can capture in the notes just to see others who would be interested in being able to review drafts and provide some feedback before it's finalized. And I see Adam and Tara.
Sorry, you can go ahead. I was just going to chime in as a non-committee member, but I can save my comment for a minute.
Oh, no worries, Adam. Thank you. I was just going to ask, I know, Colin, you said that this was posted yesterday, so I was asking about the timeliness of feedback, and are you still taking it? Because I didn't get a chance to review it, but I would love to.
I honestly don't know the answer to that question. I don't have any issue with incorporating comments. I would kind of need to check with with others in the agency, I guess. It went through our internal review process already. But I'm happy to bring that back and check, because I don't mind incorporating additional comments.
Yeah, I mean, I'm happy to read just based on what Jared just said, for my own understanding too of the process, and aligning it with my understanding so far. So it's good regardless of whether the feedback kind of makes it into a version or not. Thanks.
Okay, great.
I have a question.
Sure. Please go ahead.
I've done plenty of carbon inventories, and I'm wondering if this one includes not just the measurement of the fuels burned, but also what it took, for example, to create a truck that delivers propane to a home, in terms of the energy that took to move that metal to wherever it's getting used, and we'll turn it into a truck, and the tires, and so on and so on. I haven't seen that in an inventory ever, I don't think.
So you're talking about like the kind of more life cycle, like upstream?
The embedded, what's known as the embedded energy.
Yeah, this inventory does not include that. There is kind of, when we get to contract updates, there is an analysis going on right now that I'm kind of working with a contractor on, that does touch on that, and that's related to kind of all the energy use pathways in Vermont. It's a life cycle analysis on those energy pathways. So that would be included in that, but that is not kind of part of this inventory. And it's just not, it's just kind of a different framework. And so it's a different way of looking at it. And I think they're both legitimate. It's kind of like, but definitely understand the benefits of getting a handle on the life cycle and embedded emission, as you call them, as well.
Thank you.
Sure.
And Adam, did you have a comment or question?
Yeah, I was just going to chime in support of Colin's suggestion here to maybe run through the methodology of the inventory. Obviously, I know where to find Colin. We've talked about a lot of these things as it relates to regulated utilities that the department deals with, but certainly would not hurt to have that discussion brought into this forum so that others can chime in and provide feedback. And as we speak, I'm writing up a testimony talking about the work that this group is doing and how we need to align utility proceedings, investments, and alternative supplies with the state's inventory. So yeah, I think this is the right place to do that. That's all.
Thanks, Adam. Right. Colin, do you want to proceed?
Sure. So noting the time, I think I will definitely talk about this slide, which is kind of the overall picture, and you can get a little bit of a sense, at least on the sector by sector. I think if I try to go through all the sectors individually at this point, I'm going to use up most of the rest of our time on this meeting. So maybe I'll kind of leave that to you, whether or not you all want me to do that. But I'll at least talk a little bit about this slide and take a few questions. So this is from the report, and this is kind of our historic picture of the emissions, kind of including by sector, from 1990 through 2020. And you'll see the dip in 2020, like I mentioned. It also has kind of the mandatory reduction levels on there for 2025, 2030, and 2050. And I think I mentioned this before, but just to note again that this inventory is kind of it sets the baseline. It kind of sets the official totals by kind of whether or not we hit those emissions reductions by the required date. And so, yeah, it definitely, I appreciate all the review comments, because it's good to talk through all of these methodologies and data sets and things. I get very immersed in all of it, but and I kind of try to become as much of an expert as I have tried to become as much of an expert as I can in all the different fields. But it's always great to have input from others who may know more in a space than I do. So yeah, I'm definitely happy to take that back and try to get that kind of process moving. But yeah, so I guess there's not a whole lot additional on this slide other than just kind of taking in the totals by the sector. But I don't know if there are any specific questions, or Jared, what your thoughts are about kind of zipping through the sectors. I always think I can do that quickly, and then it always ends up taking me way longer than I think. So.
I mean, yeah, just with the time, I wonder if folks who have had a chance to review the documents that were in the agenda have specific questions. I would want to make sure that we get to those, or observations that you think are worth kind of sharing and then discussing as a subcommittee. Because I think you're right that it would be hard to stay on our timeline for the agenda if we went through sector by sector. I'm happy to dive in with one observation that I thought was interesting, which was on pages 9 and 10 of the inventory, Colin. There's this comparison between Vermont and US emissions, kind of the sector by sector share of the total emissions. And, you know, for Vermont, as long as we've had inventories, it's always been the case that of our energy sectors, electricity has been the lowest emitting of the three, and transportation's usually the top. 2020, that was replaced by the thermal sector. But it's interesting if you look at, I think the EPA just released their latest data through 2020, which you also included here. And this is the first time that I've ever seen, I think the last time the EPA released their inventory, it was the first time maybe that, if I'm recalling correctly, that transportation surpassed the electricity sector as the highest emitting sector nationally. And now the residential, commercial, and industrial fuel use sector has also surpassed the electricity sector and is now the second highest emitting sector nationwide. And I think that reflects a couple of things. I think it reflects that we have policy and regulatory strategies, both at the national and at the state level, that require our electricity sector to get lower emitting over time. And we don't have the same policies in those other energy sectors. And so we're driving one down, which is great, but these others are rising in terms of the share. And it's just, if you had told somebody, you know, a couple of years, or, you know, 10 years ago, that the electricity sector would be the third largest emitting sector nationwide after transportation and the thermal sector, I don't know if they would have believed it. I think it's both a sign of great progress in the electricity sector. It's also a sign that we're not doing enough and need to employ, you know, strategies in those other sectors and other sectors beyond that as well, to make sure that we're not just pushing down in one place and, you know, having kind of a whack-a-mole situation.
Yeah, I think that's a really interesting observation. I guess I do just want to caveat, and I do recall hearing that same stat that you mentioned, that that breakout in the previous inventory was the first time that had happened. I guess I just want to caveat this graph a little bit with the kind of national emissions inventory. The national greenhouse gas inventory breaks out these emissions in a whole lot of different ways. And so this is my best attempt to match these sectors to Vermont's inventory. And so what you see in the actual kind of EPA's gigantic 800-page report is not going to look exactly like this.
They have separate wedges for residential fuel use, commercial fuel use, and industrial fuel use. They don't add it up the way that we do for a buildings or thermal sector, right?
Right, and they do, and they have a lot of different ways they group the emissions totals as well. But so this is, I don't remember what table it's from. I think I have it in there somewhere, but But yeah, this is me kind of saying, well, based on this description in EPA's giant table, I think this matches pretty well with our residential, commercial, industrial sector. And so the totals, you won't find kind of those percentages in EPA's report exactly, but just wanted to note that, but agree, I think that's an interesting observation.
Any other questions or comments that folks have on either the inventory or the methodology document?
And yeah, apologies, I didn't give you all a little more lead time to read those, but I did just get them posted yesterday. So
Colin, I had a question about water treatment facilities. I know you have some of the wastewater units covered under the waste sector. And so I was just curious, I mean, I imagine the level of emissions is lower at the water treatment facilities, but just trying to, maybe it's captured in the electric sector or the industrial portion or somewhere else, but I didn't see it specifically called out in my quick glance through, sorry. Yeah.
I don't think I have it in this slide presentation, but yes, the kind of waste and solid waste and wastewater are broken out, certainly. I'm really hoping that I did put them both in the table, but I certainly have that information. And yes, wastewater is lower. That's mostly based on kind of EPA defaults for kind of the wastewater systems. And I do change a couple of those default parameters in there, specifically the number of households on septic systems, because they're kind of broken out in different emission factors for different components of that. But yes, that is in there. That is one area that I think wastewater, I could probably update some of those values. I've been in discussions with our kind of wastewater section in A&R, and they're incredibly busy, but they have said that is something that we could look into in the future. They didn't have data for me to kind of plug in right now, but might be able to come up with some of that. So yeah, that's definitely an area that I think we could get a little bit better, more local data for going forward.
Yeah, and just to clarify, I see you have wastewater in there. I meant water. Okay. Because they also operate a lot of the pumps and heavy equipment, which could lead to emissions. And compared to wastewater, which also oftentimes have the waste to energy type of facilities, which relate more directly with emissions. I didn't know if there was any water treatment data captured, but I'm good since you're already you've connected with the right folks. So yeah, thanks.
Okay, great. Thanks.
Richard.
Colin, do you have a slide that shows the year by year electricity emissions? It's in the document.
Yes.
Yeah, this one. Can you? I really noticed that the years 2012 through 2017 are way up compared to both earlier years and later years. What happened in 2012 to 2017?
I did see that question in my email from you, Richard. I don't know that off the top of my head. I would have to go back and kind of look. I can figure it out pretty quickly, I think. But I'm confident that it has to do because the vast majority of emissions in the sector come kind of from the purchase of the system mix. And Claire, if you have insights into this, please feel free to jump in. Or Adam, but I
would be taking a wild guess, but I might suggest it has something to do with the closure of Vermont Yankee. I don't remember the timing of that, but that was a significant carbon-free resource that would have shown up in the inventory. Again, this is me going off of recollection, not plant closure dates or final delivery dates, but that appears to be roughly in line with it. And then the res did not kick in until, what was it, 2016. So there was an interim period where we didn't have Vermont Yankee, but we also didn't have a res. But those are good questions, and I guess I could dig into it a little bit more. Maybe Colin and I could follow up.
Okay, I expected the answer would be something like that, but it's so striking that if I were your editor, I would ask you to address it. But since you've already finished the document, it's a bit late now. I have just a quick comment about the wastewater and solid waste. I have recently done a pretty in-depth analysis of some proposed changes to Middlebury's wastewater treatment plant, and it has alerted me to a whole bunch of issues I was totally unaware of. And I would be glad of a chance, Colin, sometime to go over that analysis with you, because I'm an epidemiologist, not an engineer, and so I hope I've done it right. The big thing that I learned is that the methane that is a product of an anaerobic digester added to our system is new methane. And so you can't call it you can't call it renewable, because it's new methane that wouldn't otherwise be produced. And it's often people often lose track of. They say, "Oh, you can burn the methane and make electricity, or you can burn the methane to do useful work," but you're still burning something that wasn't even there before. So it's been educational to me, and I find it hard to understand summaries across hundreds or thousands of wastewater treatment plants, and I particularly now am leery of applying national averages to individual treatment plants, because of the details of the design have a lot to do with the emissions that come from the plant.
Thanks, Richard.
Yeah.
Elizabeth, I see your, oh, sorry, go ahead, Colin.
No, I can certainly believe that, Richard. I feel like there are a lot of these situations where kind of the devil's in the details, and yet some of them are capturable kind of in our current methodologies, some of them aren't. But that being said, if we can figure out a way to improve the methodology to capture that greater nuance and detail, I'm all for that. So yeah, I'd be happy to talk to you about it. I think that is an interesting topic for sure.
Elizabeth.
Thanks. Can you all hear me okay?
Yeah.
I'm on a double thing
Yes.
here. Thanks for all your work on this, Colin. It's a huge amount of work. I'm scanning through the document right now, so I apologize if you cover this somewhere, but I have kind of a three-part question. I was curious just the time frame when you started the work. I'm just curious about the labor that went into it and how long it took. And then the other question I have is just a very general one, two very kind of general questions. These are all estimates. I'm much more familiar with this process at the university level. So how confident are you in these estimates? And then where do you see the biggest opportunities for improving either the quality of the data or the data collection process? Maybe you have a couple of thoughts, but where would you like to see? We've touched on a couple of things where we could use a little bit more information or better information, or better process. We can always be improving these processes. So I'm curious about your thoughts on that.
Sure. Yeah, let's start with the first one. Kind of how long did it take? It really kind of depends on the year, frankly. This year took a little bit longer because I really tried to kind of rebuild my master Excel workbook. I've been doing it for must be like 6 years now. Is when I kind of took it over, and there have been a lot of kind of changes and little methodology changes, or not so little ones since then. And so this year I kind of wanted to start with a clean slate. So it took me a little longer this year. Usually it's kind of reviewing all the different modules and then just updating a year or updating kind of the background calculations if needed to get that additional year. But the review process this time also took a long time. So I think probably I started it in earnest, I don't know, maybe September or October of last year, and had been doing kind of some before that, but really kind of buckled down on it then. Yeah, in terms of kind of the data set question, I know this is jumping to your last one first, but I think that probably the thermal sector is the place where there's the most opportunity for improvement. And that's because that one really relies almost exclusively on, the data, the SEDS data, the State Energy Data System data, it's a large federal data set where they have, you may be very familiar with it, where they have lots of estimates by sector and end use for energy use and emissions and all kinds of information in there. But it is modeled data that a lot of it, and I think they have different sources, but a lot of it is based on kind of survey and kind of extrapolation or kind of scaling national estimates to states. And so that, I guess, gets a little bit at your second question: how confident am I in this data? It really depends, I guess. It's never going to be exactly right because there are too many unknowns and too much uncertainty in a lot, specifically the data sources. But I think what we strive for is to kind of at least maintain comparability from one year to the next. So we try to use the best data and methods we can to get the most accurate numbers, but there's a lot of inherent uncertainty even in some of the biggest drivers, like transportation fuel use, for example, and it gets at boundaries and kind of where you draw the boundaries. So like right now we're using fuel sales for Vermont, but we have no way to really know what percentage of that fuel sold in Vermont was actually burned in Vermont. And so there are things like that, or we used to use vehicle miles traveled, but that gets into a whole nother can of worms. And well, how do you actually estimate that? And so I guess that's a long-winded answer, but I'm confident that we're doing the best we can with the available data sets, and that kind of we're in line with all the other states that are doing this as well. Kind of nobody has a perfect way to do this at the state scale. But there are definitely plenty of areas where additional data or more granular data would be really helpful to improve those estimates and make them more accurate. With the caveat that if you improve it too much right now, it no longer really is comparable back to 1990. And so you either have to figure out a way to somehow adjust all that data backwards to 1990 or figure out what difference you're causing in those estimates and if it's a reasonable one or not. Hopefully that answers your question, but all right.
Okay, anything else before we move on? I'll just say in the methodology document, I appreciated the description of the global warming potential bio, the GWP bio on page 23 in section 3.3, Colin. I know that question of how to assess life cycle emissions from wood, whether used for electricity generation or heat, has come up multiple times in this subcommittee. I know it's been a focus of Richard's. It's been an interest of many of us. So I thought that was really helpful, and I appreciated learning about the biogenic carbon footprint calculator for harvested wood products from World Wildlife Fund. And I imagine that will continue to be a topic of conversation and further research and analysis as we do the life cycle analysis and as other conversations proceed. Just want to recommend that to folks, that if you didn't see it, I thought, Richard, you'd be particularly interested, and others maybe as well, in that section in the methodology document on GWP Bio. I guess the question for you, Colin, would be, did you find any other kind of approaches along those lines other than what WWF had put together? And can you just talk about the decision to kind of use that tool? Were there any alternatives, or was that really all you could find?
Well, honestly, Richard's kind of investigation into that is what turned me on to that tool. And I'd heard him mention that previously, the GWP Bio piece. But yeah, I didn't explore that thoroughly. I think that the whole biogenic carbon dioxide piece, and I should have mentioned this as kind of a fundamental in the inventory, is that the methodology for the inventory, which is kind of in the IPCC, it's how they tell you to do it. States are really struggling with how to actually do it in their inventories right now. And this is going to probably be a bit of a rabbit hole conversation, but essentially the guidance is that the biogenic carbon dioxide is captured in the land use sector. And so it's not included in the actual kind of gross totals in your inventory. And so that's how we do it at the moment. And IPCC also suggests tracking those separately, which we also do for a few sectors. I haven't completed that calculation for every sector yet. But it gets a little challenging in that the land use sector, and this is one that I didn't get to, but I probably should have. It's at the end of this slideshow. The land use sector, we did actually update in this iteration of the inventory. It's a more full IPCC framework in this inventory than it has been, and it includes all the land use change estimates and the forestry, which is the biggest part for us. It is not, in my opinion, it's not super accurate in that it's using kind of spatial data, annual spatial data to determine fluxes from land use changes. And I think that's a really hard thing to do, especially with how granular the data, that spatial data is, and it's getting better all the time. But I think those estimates are kind of rough compared to other estimates in the inventory. And so having that be the method by which those emissions are counted in the net framework, I think that's tough. And so GWP Bio was kind of my middle ground, I guess, just to kind of provide some information, some different view of, it's not counting, or it's not kind of zeroing biogenic emissions. It's not counting them as full kind of everything emitted to the atmosphere, but it's giving some partial credit for that resequestering, but not full credit anymore. And so that was kind of the middle ground I was hoping to convey with that. And I know that's a really long-winded answer to your question, but I didn't explore a whole lot, but I think there will be a lot more exploration and trying to get a better handle on how to deal with that going forward.
I also want to thank you for doing that work, for including that analysis in the report, Colin. I really, it shows that you were listening to what people were telling you, and I appreciate that a lot.
You're very welcome. It's very interesting, for sure. And I definitely have a lot to learn in that space as well, but it's a complicated area, the whole forests and land use change, and and all the carbon fluxes. And I don't think anybody, frankly, has a great handle on it yet, at least at a statewide level, but we're, yeah, learning a lot and trying to incorporate it into the inventories as we go.
Richard.
I'm reminded of Colin, just one other piece. There's a place in the methodology document where you talk about how you make the assertion that Vermont is not a major exporter of manufactured goods. And we're not. We're more of an, I'm sure we're a net importer of manufactured goods, although we do export some things. But what we do export is farm products. And
Jared made that exact same point to me before this call. I think that's a really good point. I hadn't really been considering that in the consumption-based space, but I should have been. So yeah, I need to go back and revisit that.
Yeah, that was the one kind of substantive piece that where I didn't feel where I raised a question, which is that I am not sure that if and when Vermont has a consumption-based inventory, those totals would be higher than our in-boundary inventory. And the reason for that is I agree with Colin and Richard that we are a net importer of manufactured goods and that there's more, as Ken Jones would say, energy intensive manufacturing that happens elsewhere than happens here, things like steel, cement, aluminum, etc. But there is a significant amount of methane in our agricultural sector, especially to our dairy sector, related to milk and cheese production that is consumed elsewhere, that is exported. And in a consumption-based inventory, all of that would be subtracted. So I wouldn't feel comfortable saying that it's likely that a consumption-based inventory would be higher than our existing inventory until we actually saw the numbers and how those exports and imports netted out. I think that there would be pressure in both directions, and which one would net out higher or lower. I would want to see the data first.
Yeah, I think that's fair.
Okay. With that, I think unless there's any other questions or comments or discussion on the inventory or the methodology document, I think we can probably move to the contractual work updates. I don't want to prematurely close this discussion because I don't know as though the contractual work updates will take as long as we have given them in the agenda, and I don't see any members of the public. I mean, we will pause at 2:45 to see if there is public comment, but I just don't want people to be suppressing a question or a comment based on the timing of the agenda, because I think we actually have a little bit more buffer than we might think. Richard, please go ahead.
Colin, upon reading the report, I actually had some insights about natural gas that I had not had previously. And I see that we are, as before, we are counting releases of natural gas, methane, from distribution pipelines and transmission pipelines in state, but not those that occur in other states, even though all of our natural gas is imported from other states. So if you were, say, Pennsylvania,
very small fraction of biogas that's coming from Vermont.
Yes. So if you were doing a comparable inventory for Ohio or Pennsylvania, places that are net producers of exporters of natural gas, or North Dakota, if you were to follow that line of reasoning, then North Dakota ought to count all of the releases of natural gas from transmission pipelines as the natural gas is being shipped east. They ought to count that in their inventory.
Yep.
Do you think they are?
To the extent they have an inventory, yes. I guess one kind of interesting piece there, and that is an absolutely true statement that I have no idea if states like North Dakota have a greenhouse gas inventory. But I will say EPA did within, I think in the last year, they put out greenhouse gas emission inventories for all the states that are based on kind of their national report that they submit to the UNFCCC as part of the Paris goals. And so they have that data and they disaggregated that to all the states. That's actually what the data I referenced that I used for the land use change and forestry sector. So there is an inventory for every state now. Whether or not they accept that as their official inventory or have one is another question. But yeah, that's the idea. And that's where that's where it gets into a little bit of a boundary issue in terms of the analysis, where you would count that in a life cycle analysis, where and that will be counted in our life cycle analysis, those kind of upstream out of state emissions, even from like the extraction of that gas from the ground. But where you kind of run into potential problems, is if that other state is already counting those. And I think that's why this framework for this inventory exists as it does. And it's kind of like, so if we were to include those emissions from Ohio, wherever, that come from the extraction of that gas or the transmission of that gas, and they were also including it in their inventory, then we'd be double counting it. And so that's why I think the guidance right now is to kind of cut it at your state borders. But it's a different way of looking at what people are ultimately responsible for, or states are ultimately responsible for. And it's not.
So if you do the thought experiment, if somebody next week discovered a natural gas field in Addison County, and we started producing natural gas in Addison County for consumption in our state, we would suddenly be counting the natural gas, the greenhouse gas consequences of the natural gas we burn very differently than we do now, only because it's being produced in state and not somewhere else. That seems artificial to me.
We would be counting. We would be counting it more to the extent that we were using more. It's not like we're not counting the natural gas being burned in Vermont. We're just not counting the leakage from the pipelines or the actual extraction process.
Yeah, and counting the fugitive emissions gives you 10 or 15% greater greenhouse gas impact than if you don't. So it's non-trivial.
Yeah.
So what I'm saying is that if it happened that we were producing natural gas in Vermont, we would be counting the greenhouse gas impact of the natural gas we use differently than we are currently.
That is true. Yep. Yeah, and it's a good point. And I think it's not straightforward in terms of like the boundary issues is really what that's all about. And yeah, the life cycle versus the kind of in-state boundaries.
Right, with that, I think we can move on to the updates. Colin, I'm sorry, we're asking you to talk a lot, but I know that these are important updates and people want to kind of stay
That's all right.
What's going on?
Yeah, if you feel free to tune me out. So yeah, the first one, I think, sorry, I don't have the agenda in front of me. The first one was the measuring, tracking progress tools. All right. Okay. So the measuring and tracking progress tool, I can't remember how much has been shared with you all previously, but I'll just give a very brief kind of rundown of what it is. And it's essentially going to be a tool that tracks kind of metrics and indicators associated with reducing greenhouse gas emissions or adaptation and resilience efforts in Vermont. And it's going to be a pretty large effort in that I think the intention is to kind of capture a pretty holistic picture of all the actions going on, and especially those that are kind of around state government as well as the climate action plan. And so the task is really to come up with first kind of a logic model. And Richard, I think you were the one who maybe suggested this a long time ago in this process, but kind of mapping out where these reductions are kind of going to be seen, or the indicators that are going to kind of measure whether or not we're making progress in an area. And so the first step is to kind of come up with that logic model and then figure out what indicators or metrics we will be tracking kind of associated with those. And then to find the data sets or identify the gaps that we need to fill in order to kind of make that a more comprehensive picture of progress in actions and resilience and adaptation that we're making.
Just before you go on, I just wanted to pause to ask, Richard had put a note in the chat wondering if you could unshare for this part just so we can see each other.
Oh, yes, I'm sorry. I meant to stop that before, but I didn't. Yes, thanks, Richard. Yeah, so that's kind of the background behind that. We are in the process of finalizing an RFP for that part of the work. The kind of second phase, which is farther out, is going to be to actually build the tool, which is going to be a more public-facing dashboard that uses that kind of database of all that data. So there will definitely be, and we haven't really figured out the details of it yet, but there will definitely be a space for, again, this subcommittee to engage in that kind of discussion of appropriate metrics and kind of figure out what we want to track and how to track it. And so I'll certainly be in touch with you all about that process as we go forward with this RFP. And so you can all start thinking about it now in terms of it's going to be a big, I think it's going to be a big ask in terms of there are going to be hundreds of different pieces of information that we're going to try to track in this thing. So, but looking forward to kind of engaging either the whole group or a subgroup of science and data in coming up with those and working through some of that with the contractor. I don't know if there are any. Yeah, Claire, go ahead.
I just wanted to flag, it seems like this, I don't know if the intention is to sort of revise the original task group that had been thinking about this, but at least from the Just Transition Subcommittee, there were discussions a while back around equity related metrics. And I know some of the recommendations from that subcommittee kind of touched on that in the climate action plan. So it seems like also pulling in folks from other subcommittees and including that one might be helpful, just to make sure we get a comprehensive view.
Yeah, I think that's a great idea. And I should have mentioned equity was one of the pieces we're going to try to figure out what metrics and indicators to follow in there too. So yeah, that's a great idea. Thanks.
Colin, can I just request that once that RFP is ready, that it be shared with the committee?
Sure.
And I don't know if it's helpful, folks who were on the task group and any additional folks reviewing the draft. I know that's been helpful in the past. I'd be happy to help with that. I don't know where that stands, if it's ready to go or if it's still in process. Or...
Sorry, the RFP or it's not quite ready to go. It's gone through a little bit of edits, but is not finalized yet. So when it is, I think I should be able to share with this group, no problem.
Anything else on that? Okay, now I think we can go to life cycle analysis update.
Sure. So life cycle analysis update. Again, I think I've shared some of this with you all before, so I'm going to keep it relatively high level, but if you do have specific questions you want me to dive in more, let me know. But and I touched on this a little bit in the presentation before, but so this analysis is ongoing, and ERG is our contractor for it. They are analyzing kind of the life cycle emissions and factor for all the energy pathways of existing and emerging in Vermont. And so they right now are going through the process of, the idea is for them to use the GREET model as their framework. And so GREET has a very robust kind of calculation pathway, I guess we'll call it. And I will say that ERG is seem very knowledgeable in this life cycle space, which has been great. Their idea is to kind of pull out the various kind of calculation pathways from the GREET model, and then to the extent they can, based on kind of the data available for Vermont, to kind of tailor the specific portions of those pathways to be more Vermont specific. So like different emission factors or transport distances or what have you. So they're working on some of that right now, and at least kind of putting the framework together at this point. We have had a little bit of a kind of hiccup in the timeline where we are doing some outreach to traditional ecological knowledge, TEK experts, to try to review some of these pathways and process to provide their input on things that could be included or ways that this analysis could be shifted to incorporate some of those kind of different views and different ways of thinking. I think it's been a little bit challenging to find somebody at this point who will fill that role, but we're still working on that process. So that has kind of slowed down the timeline for the analysis, but the idea, I think, was that it would be done by the end of July. I don't know if that timeline will hold. I think it likely will not at this point, but hopefully by the end of the summer sometime, I think we could expect that to be finalized. And the final product is going to essentially be that kind of workbook with all the different kind of emissions pathways and various sensitivity kind of scenarios with emission factors kind of for every step along the way that we will be able to kind of adjust and update as we need going forward. And then the idea being that they will be able to apply those factors to some of the activity data like fuel use, et cetera, in the greenhouse gas emissions inventory to kind of come up with a whole life cycle estimate for the different energy sectors in the inventory. And I'm still going to have to look more closely to better understand if they will match up exactly, but it seems like they should. And regardless, it seems like it'll be a really interesting and informative product that they come out with. And the caveat, and they're going to kind of dig into this with us a little bit in the coming weeks, is what data is actually available for Vermont to kind of tailor these factors. And so we're going to have to be trying to find some data sources that they need, and they haven't told us specifically yet what those are, but they're working on kind of putting that list together for us to review and try to come up with sources for. So yeah, I guess I'll leave it there, and if you have any questions.
Elizabeth, please go ahead.
Just quick question. Are you looking, Colin, for an EK expert in Vermont or nationally?
I think Vermont would be ideal. I don't know who, I haven't been as deeply involved in that portion of the discussion, but I know ERG had a few people in mind, and we've been working specifically with Judy Dow, who has raised this issue, to try to find somebody, and she's done some outreach. And Claire, I think you may have already been invited to a meeting related to this, but I think Jane was going to invite you to one soon. So about trying to find a path forward and trying to come up with a way to do this. But yeah, Elizabeth, I don't know if you have suggestions of people who might have that expertise, but if you do, that would be great.
Well, I'm that's why I asked. I might, but it'd be more, it wouldn't be in Vermont. It'd be somebody without that, I guess, place-based connection. So if I can be helpful, let me know. But
Okay.
But if there's an option to involve representatives from other states, I don't know how that plays into the goals of integrating ecological knowledge into this, but anyway, let me know.
Okay, that's great. Jane is kind of taking the lead on that portion of this. I'll definitely mention that to her. I think they're definitely looking outside of Vermont right now. I think they're trying to keep it kind of regional, at least right now.
Yeah.
But
yeah, that makes sense. Yep.
I'll mention that to her because, like I said, I think they're struggling to find somebody at this point. So
yeah. And that was my thinking. If you expand outside of Vermont, while not ideal, certainly the number of people you might be able to involve would be greater. So
yeah.
Anyway, thanks.
All right, that's great. Thank you very much.
Richard, please go ahead.
Yeah, so part of the Affordable Heat Act calls for the analysis of dozens or perhaps hundreds, as Jared said, of measures to reduce greenhouse gases from building heat to be assessed as to their greenhouse gas emissions. Say if somebody wants to propose to move a building from fuel oil to electricity, there's conversions of that type are supposed to get scored as to the greenhouse gas reductions to be expected from investing in that particular measure. So at least in the domain of building heat, seems like there are possibly two parallel processes, one that this contractor is doing and one that is, at least that is still theoretical, but which would be done by the Public Utility Commission and a contractor that they would hire. Do you have a sense for how those are supposed to connect to each other?
Richard, I would offer that I think that it's right that they're they should be aware of each other, and there should be some kind of sharing and communication. But I do think they're fundamentally different projects in that the life cycle analysis is looking to assess life cycle emissions for overall fuel use and overall sectors and subsectors for the kind of life cycle, the supplemental life cycle analysis that the council and climate action office are doing. Whereas the life cycle analysis that would happen as a result of the clean heat standard, if it goes into effect, would be on a fuel pathway basis. And it would be much more specific to each individual fuel, how it was produced, its transportation pathway. I think that the best example for comparison is all of the fuel pathways. I think there's over 200, maybe 230 or so fuel pathways that Oregon has developed for the life cycle analysis, because of course within each fuel type, the life cycle emissions can vary greatly depending on what the source is, how it was produced, was there direct or indirect land use change, et cetera, et cetera. So my sense is that what would have to happen for the clean heat standard life cycle analysis would have to be at a much more granular, specific fuel pathway basis than what would be happening at a more macro level for the life cycle analysis, where life cycle factors are going to be plugged in for, average fuel types by subsector. But others, please say if you have a different view of it. But I think that they're related, but I think that they're different in their level of granularity and specificity.
Yeah, I've partly with your stimulus, Jared. I've I don't know whether anybody listens to me personally or not, but I've publicly stated both in the Addison Independent and in Vermont Digger that I'm confident that the life cycle analysis process for biofuels and for wood for heat will produce low values for greenhouse gas savings. That would produce low values for clean heat credits because of my understanding of the domain. But that in any case, people that are distrustful or concerned that biofuels or wood will get too high a score should be paying attention to the process by which the scores are assigned. And I'm hopeful that when the Affordable Heat Act goes into effect, that the commission and its staff will do those analyses in a transparent and publicly accessible fashion so that people have input into them.
Absolutely. So my question, Colin, on the life cycle analysis, and you may not have the answer to this, but if you can share it with Jane or others, my recollection is that there was just one meeting of the task group right after ERG was selected, but there has not been a subsequent meeting of the task group, either to share updates or to engage in conversation, hear feedback. So I think it would be really valuable to have another task group meeting before the project gets baked, so that there's an opportunity to ask questions and hear feedback on the design of the project. I think Jane said that was planned, but I haven't heard anything. So just we can check on that. I think it would be good.
Sure. Yeah, I will check on it, and I should probably, I'll probably be in charge of scheduling that, I think. But I guess I will say at this point in the process, they've kind of put out, they've given us kind of a draft of kind of data sources and the model that, and most of them say GREET. And so they have evaluated a few different kind of alternative tools for various pathways, but I think GREET is really the only one that they ended up going with after looking at them all in terms of their framework for various reasons, and they go into those. But they haven't really given us kind of a final product to review yet, and they've been with the kind of incorporation of the TEK piece that is not where the timeline has slowed down on that, not being able to kind of find somebody. They're kind of in a holding pattern right now. And so I can certainly schedule that. I'm not sure how much kind of additional information there will be to share other than what you have already seen. But I can talk to Jane and yeah, happy to.
If you're waiting for the report that has that summary of data sources and the kind of, discussion questions, then I think we can wait. I don't want to arbitrarily force that. I just want to make sure. I think we've only had one meeting, and it sounds like it's getting fairly far along. And I think it would be good to have an update and a chance to check in and ask questions about the assumptions and methodology and process from the task group.
Sure. Yeah, I'll work on scheduling that, because regardless, I'm sure there will definitely be some new stuff, and we can probably talk about the draft Excel workbook anyway. And
if there's questions about data sources, do they exist? Do they not exist? What could proxy data or model data be? It may be that members of the task group could be helpful on some of those data availability questions. So.
Yeah, definitely. And they flagged for us, I think it was yesterday, that they were working on that list, but they didn't have it together yet. So when they do, I will certainly, reach out if there's things that we don't know, and I'm sure there will be. So.
Anything else on life cycle analysis updates? Since we are almost at 2:45, I will pause to see if there is anybody joining who would like to provide public comment. I think everybody joining is a subcommittee member, so I'm not expecting it, but I want to pause to make sure that we provide that opportunity. And seeing and hearing none, I'm happy to provide a brief update as you requested, Richard, on the biomass task group recommendations and the council meeting that happened on Monday. Others, please feel free to add. So what I'm pasting in the chat is the recommendations that were originally submitted to the council from the biomass task group in December, because there were a number of vacancies, and more specifically because there were a number, basically all of the House appointees, I think the understanding from Jane and others was that the terms expired in October, and until they were reappointed, we didn't have, whatever it was, 7 or 8 House appointees on the council. And so it made it really difficult to have meetings and figure out quorum with both vacancies in existing seats and this gap in appointments. Those were made. We eventually scheduled this last council meeting that was on Monday specifically to address this topic of those recommendations. There were a lot of questions that were asked. It was a very deliberative process. I think there were many people who showed up who were not on the council or on the subcommittee, many interested members of the public speaking for and against those recommendations. The way the process played out is, as you can see if you're looking at those recommendations, there was not consensus among the committee either on the recommendations or specifically on whether to call for a study of biomass generation and a whole bunch of associated issues, or to presume that biomass electricity should be phased out and do a study about how to do that. So they provided these 2 different options. Option 1, do a study to assess the question, or option 2, assume the outcome and move forward with a plan to phase out biomass electricity. That's a rough summary of those 2 options. That was the first kind of question that was called in the meeting. I don't believe there was any counselor who supported option 2. Everybody either supported option 1, which was do the study and don't presuppose the outcome, or people abstained or just did not vote. So it wasn't entirely clear where to go from there. So the question was put forward to the council about the recommendations as a whole. And I think I have the notes. I don't believe they've been posted, but the result of that vote was 12 councilors voted against the recommendations. 1 voted for accepting them. 1 abstained, 6 were not present. 2 of the seats are vacant, and 1 it was not clear because it was a council member who was at the meeting but then had to leave before the vote. So those recommendations are not moving forward as proposed. The council had too many questions and concerns about them. So where it was left was that counselors were invited to provide feedback on the recommendations, suggested revisions, things that would need to be addressed or changed in order for them to feel comfortable advancing a different set of recommendations related to biomass. And I think that the question about the process and way forward on that was asked to be taken up by the steering committee. So that's my high level update about what happened. But there's a lot of, rich substance and material that's if folks are interested to either watch the video and I'm sure that there will be notes from the meeting that got into some of the key questions and pros and cons, more substantive than the kind of more just the what happened overview that I just gave. Anyone want to add to that or any other questions about that? Elizabeth, yes, please.
This is a little bit of a I don't know. It's a question that may or may, well, it's relevant because I have it. But thanks for that update, Jared. That's really interesting. It's such a challenging issue. Somebody asked me this today, and I didn't know the answer to it, so I thought I'd just ask you here. Has there been a much research or investigation into technology solutions that could address the actual emissions on the plant, such as scrubbers? I know next to nothing about this, but has that issue been explored? Are there things that could happen to the plant itself that could be sort of a helpful discussion to have in light of how controversial the existence of the plant is? Has that been
Can I ask
part of anything?
emissions of greenhouse gases or of other pollutants?
I guess to address other pollutants. I mean, particulate matter, I guess, specifically. Because that's part of where a lot of the health questions come up, right?
The plant is heavily regulated by the state and by US EPA in terms of its emissions of particulates and other potential pollutants. The concern of the Biomass Committee was initially mostly about the CO2 emissions, although concern about the other pollutants did come up, particularly the particulates in the neighborhoods within a mile or two of the plant. And it's operating within the parameters of its permit. It meets the requirements that have been put on it by the state for emissions of particulates. Now you could argue that those requirements are not tight enough, and that's what the health study business is about. The idea that the existing regulation is not sufficient to avoid health impacts on the neighborhoods close to the plant, and so it should be regulated more tightly. And so the solution would be could be a technological solution. The sort of short version, of course,
if that's the issue,
is that if the plant closed down entirely, then the particulates would not be an ongoing problem. And much of the conversation on the biomass task group was about trying to understand, is the model that they use for acquiring the wood that they burn carbon neutral or not? Or is this really a major source of net CO2 emissions? That was the main question that I thought we were tasked to try to address. And there's no way you can burn wood and not produce CO2.
And I think it gets back to the very questions that we were addressing in the inventory. There are distinctions between, and it matters how you count between biogenic and fossil emissions, or biogenic and geologic emissions. There's differences between point source emissions and life cycle emissions. And so just the definition of terms and the consistency and the apples to apples comparison is is really important. Adam, I saw your hand. I wanted to see if you had anything that you wanted to add on that.
It was just in response to Elizabeth's comment. I know for Rygate a number of years ago, they had to invest in some just traditional air pollution controls, not greenhouse gas emissions, in order to qualify for renewable energy credit sales to the state of Connecticut for their RPS. And I believe McNeil, I'm just looking at the data from BED from last year, they do sell RECs from McNeil to Connecticut, which again would require some level of pollution controls, but that's, once I saw that the focus of the task group was more on the greenhouse gas emissions, that's why I dropped the hand. But just to your question, Elizabeth, I believe both of them have invested in some level of pollution control that's possibly above what the EPA requires so that they could qualify to generate Connecticut RECs.
Okay. Any other questions or comments, either on that or anything else for the committee? I just want to also pause to thank you, Colin, for the work that you did on some complicated scheduling polls and doing as much as you could to accommodate different schedules by setting up these. I know it's a little, it's not the same as just having meeting the same time every month, but hopefully that allows more people to participate, or at least participate every other month if they're so thanks for doing that. And I think, when is our next meeting scheduled for? While Colin's finding that, I think one thing I'd like to pose in our last 5 minutes is if anybody on the call wants to suggest agenda items for that meeting. I mean, I think we've got a fairly, I think we've wanted to include a chance to check in on updates of the contractual analysis that's related to this committee's kind of scope and charge, but I think we also have some time in the agenda to go deeper on specific topics. So, oh, thank you, Elizabeth. So Friday, May 26th is our next scheduled.
I saw the 26th and I was like, wait, is that today's meeting? No.
So yeah, and I don't want to necessarily just put folks on the spot now. If you have thoughts on that agenda, please feel free to share them now. If something comes to you after this meeting, please email Colin and I, because we usually check in, a couple weeks beforehand to draft an agenda.
And is each meeting different from the next meeting? Even though it's trying to accommodate a lot of people, some people will dismiss some of the meetings.
Yeah, so the next one is on Friday the 26th of May at 9 o'clock.
Right.
And so that worked for more people than today's worked for, but I'm actually happy with the turnout we got today. I wasn't sure we would get quite this many people, so that's great. And
you won't just be repeating what you did today on that meeting.
No.
Okay.
No, different topic.
Okay.
But given that, I wonder if it's worth linking to the video or linking to the draft notes for the folks who weren't able to make it, so that if they were interested in this topic, they didn't feel like they were missing out. Maybe we could send that along with like a reminder before the next meeting, Colin.
Mm-hmm.
Sure. Yep. I will. I'll post the video. I don't know if I'll do it this afternoon. Probably depends on how long it takes to download it. But yeah, I'll do it in the next day or two for sure. If not this afternoon, and it'll be. I'll definitely put it on the calendar. But I can also send out a link to it as well. Claire, go ahead.
Great.
Just in terms of agendas, and I don't know if the timing would work out on this, but it seems like if ANR is ready to move forward with an RFP for the measuring and assessing tool, or if that's at a draft to review ready stage, that could be an interesting agenda item for the next meeting, or even just kind of a refresher on the timeline for that tool and sort of the scope of work that has been put together. Seems like one potential option to dive deeper.
Sure, that sounds great.
Anything else? Well, thank you, everybody, for your time and good discussion, and look forward to seeing you again in a month. And in the meantime, be well and enjoy the spring.
Mhm.
Thanks all.
Yeah.